A lot of people have ended up restricting a lot of foods, and so now they're down to, yes, they eat fruits and vegetables, but they eat 2 fruits and 2 vegetables, and that's all they rotate in between. Well, that'll feed some organisms, but not the wide variety of organisms you have.
Welcome to the Learn Skin podcast with me, Dr. Raja.
And me, Dr. Hadar, where we discuss all things skin.
Join us as we delve into the art and science of skin health in today's episode.
Hey, Raja, can you say the thing I told you to tell them?
Of course. We are board-certified dermatologists. This podcast is meant for educational and informational purposes only and is not considered medical advice, nor does it serve as a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. All opinions shared do not express the views of Learn Health, Inc. Let's get to the good stuff.
Hey, Raja, how are you today?
Hey, Hadar. I think we're talking gut testing today. We get to do some testing discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of my patients come in and they say, hey, doc, what can I do with my diet? And there's no real way to kind of understand what is happening in the gut unless we try to test it. And I think that we should talk about some gut testing and what's out there and what is the differences. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. We need some help.
Yes, we do. And, when it comes to gut testing, there's so many different ways that this can apply into thinking about just general health, gut health. But we're not going to do it alone. We have Lisa Pomeroy, who's a traditional naturopath, a functional medicine consultant, and an educator. She is on the medical education team with Diagnostic Solutions Laboratory. We'd like to welcome you to the podcast, Lisa. Excited to talk to you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I love talking all things gut, so I'm happy to be here.
And I do want to just state up front that this is a sponsored podcast with Diagnostic Solutions Laboratory, but we are going to be talking science today and very excited. So to get things kicked off, I know that we're talking about stool testing. Could you just give us an overview? How does stool testing work? And what is the situation in terms of like a patient symptomology that you might be thinking about where you might do this? Before we get into the nuts and bolts of stool testing, I'd like to kind of set the overview on where would you think about stool testing and what is it?
Sure. Yeah. So when do you think about stool testing? For me, it's in any case where there's any kind of chronic health issue, because it's surprising. A lot of people just think, oh, if there's gut issues, I'm going to do a gut test. But we don't realize that the gut really, what happens in the gut doesn't stay in the gut. And so a lot of times your skin issues, your headaches, your fatigue, all of your nutritional deficiencies, your low iron, your low B12, all of those things can often go back to dysfunction in the gut. So really for me, if someone is struggling with their health, I want to look at the gut. It's going to be at the top of my list for tests I want to do, because really if your gut isn't healthy, you can't be healthy. So with collecting the stool, it is quite easy. Not a lot of people enjoy doing it, but, it is something that everybody does. And so you just have to collect a little stool sample in a vial. I tell people, just pretend you're playing mad scientist and turn on your fan and collect, poop in your little like French fry container that comes with the kit. And, just take little samples from throughout that little bowel movement and scoop it into the vial, send it off to the lab, and then the lab will analyze it for, pathogens, which could be something like H. pylori, or parasites like Blastocystis hominis or Dientamoeba fragilis, or bacteria. So we're looking for many species of bacteria, not only the good guys, but the bad guys. So we want to make sure with the microbiome, it's all about balance. If you have too many bad guys, not enough good guys, there's going to be a problem.
This raises this whole new concept of, we used to just say, look at your poop, look at your poop. Now it's scoop your poop, right? That's what we got to be thinking about.
And it's more than just looking at it. It's really examining. So we should maybe say, take a deep dive.
Exactly, because these are all microscopic organisms. You can't see them with the naked eye, other than worms. You might be able to see a worm with the naked eye, but everything else you can't really see. Maybe if your stool is floating, maybe that's a sign you're not digesting fat. If you see food particles in the stool, maybe your digestive enzymes are low. But a lot of this stuff, you need to test it because you can't tell, do you have enough of this bacteria that's been found to prevent diabetes, prevent leaky gut, prevent gut inflammation. For that, you need to have it analyzed.
And to follow up on Raja's questions, are there specific skin conditions that you find where this testing could be useful?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of different organisms that have been specifically linked with particular skin issues. So something like psoriasis, there's a whole ton of bacteria and pathogens linked with psoriasis. So for me, if someone's coming in with that complaint, these are the top things I'm looking for. So for pathogens, H. pylori is at the top of my list. Also the parasite Blastocystis hominis that lives in the colon. Could also be other things like too many streptococcus bacteria. They'll go crazy if you have low stomach acid. If someone's on a PPI or they have low stomach acid because they're really stressed or they're low in zinc, you could see high streptococcus. High Pseudomonas is another organism that you could see associated with psoriasis. Sometimes it's high levels of the histamine producing species, things like Klebsiella or Citrobacter or Proteus or Morganella. If these are producing excess histamine, that can show up on the skin. Now, it could also be of low levels of certain organisms. So it's not just what doesn't belong or what's overgrown, but maybe you have low Akkermansia muciniphila or low Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. So all of those things, that's over half a dozen or so organisms that could be linked with psoriasis. So those are the things I'm going to look through the report and see if we have any of those to try to correlate with that condition.
Yeah, there really is an art to some of this too, isn't there, Lisa? You do the sequencing, you do the testing, but then it's that clinical scenario where you're going to start putting the pieces together. And then, from there, let's even talk about what you do when it comes to testing. Now that you've given us a really good background, there's so many different options for testing. And I love how you laid out some of the, especially with psoriasis, some of these associations that we're starting to see. But when we get into the actual testing bits, there's so many choices like 16S, or there's whole genome, or there's qPCR. Can you talk a little bit about the testing that you have available, and what are some of the advantages there that perhaps, everyone is looking at 16S? Are you different from 16S? And if so, how?
Sure. Yeah. So the lab I work for, Diagnostic Solutions Lab, we use qPCR, which the Q stands for quantitative and the PCR is polymerase chain reaction. So this is a DNA assay. So, similar to 16S in that it is, DNA, but very different in what its capabilities are. So with the qPCR, it is fully quantitative. So what that means is it can count the number of organisms per gram of stool. So say if I'm looking at something like Akkermansia muciniphila, this is the one that low levels have been linked with metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes. I want to know how many organisms did we start with? And then I want to see, we're going to do an intervention. We're going to see what does our retest look like? And I want to see, a comparison of apples to apples. How many organisms did I start with? How many did I end up with? Did it actually move? Versus other technologies, some of them are reported as percentage of the whole. So a lot of metatranscriptomic, metagenomic sequencing, 16S. A lot of times you may see these as percentages, which, the issue with that is it's a lot trickier to interpret because say you're looking at Akkermansia, maybe your percentage went up, but the actual level of the organism did not. It could be that other things around it went down. So in comparison, it looks higher, but actually maybe it went down too, or it stayed the same. Maybe it went up. It's just, it doesn't have that same interpretation, that, clarification that I like as a clinician. So that's one of the major pros of qPCR. But it's also very highly sensitive and specific and reproducible. So the thing is, it's really good at detecting low-level organisms, like something like H. pylori. H. pylori is implicated in acne, in rosacea, in psoriasis. So it's a big bad guy when it comes to a lot of skin conditions. But this one is really in low levels in the stool. So, of course, it originates up in the stomach. So we're all dependent on how much is actually shed into the GI tract on a particular day.
Yeah, exactly.
Then it's going to get diluted out because it's got a long way to travel before it comes out the other end. So you're just not going to find a lot in the stool. So a lot of these other technologies, yes, they're maybe measuring DNA, but they can't go that low. They can't go down to those few cells. Like the GI map, which is the qPCR technology technology, that stool test, that can go down to just 10 cells of H. pylori per gram of stool. So that's what I love about the qPCR is a lot of these really beneficial organisms are not found in super high levels in the stool, but they are so important to our health. And so, we need a technology, something that can go down to those lower levels and pick up some of these really important microbes.
So Lisa, can you talk a little bit about how do you differentiate between perhaps like a false positive on something that might be at super low levels, but may not be considered relevant versus something like this, where H. pylori, absolutely, we know that, you shouldn't be having any. And I like the fact that you've pointed out multiple different conditions where now we are starting to understand that there is relationships there. How do you differentiate that coming from a testing point of view?
Yeah, so when you're looking at the DNA, the nice thing about that is you don't get false positives because only that particular organism you're targeting has that exact DNA sequence. So there's no case of mistaken identity, as is the case, like, say, with when you're looking under the microscope. That could be, okay, if someone's inexperienced, maybe a bean sprout looks like a parasite, it gets misidentified, or organisms some of them can look very similar and hard to differentiate under the microscope. But with the qPCR technology, with that DNA sequencing, we know if it shows up, it matched that sequence exactly, so we know it's there. Now, there is a little bit of, skill to interpretation with qPCR, where a lot of people have to learn, if something is detected, there's like low positives, moderate positives, high positives. So there is a little bit of finessing in that, where, some things you may not treat, like say salmonella comes up. Yes, this is something we don't want to see, but it is considered self-limiting in most cases. And say if someone had no symptoms, we probably don't need to do anything about it, even though it was detected, versus something like, a parasite, a nasty parasite like Giardia. Even if that's found in low levels, again, this is very hard to find Giardia. It's not shed in large quantities. They know that it's very hard to find because it's in, again, a little more upper gut, small intestine. It can get into the bile ducts, the gallbladder. So something like that, even if it's not flagging as a high positive, if the lab finds it at any quantity, that's a problem for me, something I'm going to address, because that's a nasty thing that can blunt your villi and damage your gut as much as celiac disease.
Now, I think one good way to think about it with a PCR is that really it's like a targeted kind of testing where you need to know what kind of probes you're going to put in that little cocktail in order to find those bacteria, right?
Exactly. Yep. So there are all these probes. So that's the only downside I see with qPCR is, you have a set of microbes that you're looking for. So say like pinworms, pinworms isn't on this test. So if you have pinworms, you could have a pinworm in that sample and the lab wouldn't find it because it's not looking for it.
Exactly. And so it's useful for a really good way to pick up anything that you're actually looking for, but you may miss some things. And the other thing I wanted to say, I kind of looked through your website, very interesting, by the way, and looked at the reports. And, I think some of the reports include much more than just microbes. You mentioned the GI map report, which I think is great because there's also comments on fungi and viruses and parasites, as you alluded to before, but also just general intestinal health. I mean, I know that I started ordering for some of my patients CalProtect and other markers of health. So I think the report itself is just really good if you are interested in helping your patients managing that, even though for skin, a lot of it is still at the level of association, but we're just so young in this industry of testing and trying to understand the relationship to skin that I'm sure that in the future we'll develop much better understanding of that relationship and see what we can actually manage from the skin point of view, because we're fairly new to the gut-skin connection.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And those, I love those markers where, sometimes you're trying to figure out why is the bacteria overgrowing or what made you susceptible to the parasites or the E. coli. And it's like, it comes down to often, well, you don't have enough bile. Bile is antimicrobial. You don't have enough stomach acid. Stomach acid is highly antimicrobial. So if you don't have those things going for you, and then when we think of the skin too, again, say if there's low bile and there's major fat malabsorption, well, if you're pooping out a bunch of fat in your stool, stool, you're also pooping out your fat-soluble nutrients. So, I mean, how can you have healthy skin if you aren't absorbing your vitamin A or your vitamin D? Again, all of these can just interconnect, all these different dysfunctional areas in the gut.
No, I love the fact that we've expanded the conversation away from just the microbiome because, I mean, there's so many other factors that you look at when it comes to gut health, right, Lisa? I mean, it's not just the bacteria that are present or, whatever the microbes are, but it's these other markers that might signify that your gut has inflammation or perhaps even leaky gut.
Exactly. Yeah, like low stomach acid, we know that's been linked with acne and a lot of different skin conditions. And, if you have low stomach acid, things like streptococcus can overgrow, which is linked with psoriasis, or your histamine producers might start to overgrow, like enterococcus. So now you have other issues showing up. So that's where we can look at like a marker like elastase 1, which tells you about the sufficiency of the pancreatic enzymes. So this is something that's really important. If you're not digesting your food, not only may you not have the nutrients you need for good, healthy skin, but you may also be feeding those bugs. I always say the bugs get an all-you-can-eat buffet. If you're not digesting the food, they're going to get those nutrients instead of you.
Fantastic. So another question on this, when we're talking about gut pathogens, we always think of pathogens as, of course, the definition puts us right into the bad guy category. What are the most common gut pathogens that you find in your testing? Just, looking across the population of samples that you've looked at, and I'm sure you've looked at thousands of samples now. What are the most common pathogens that seem to come out of the testing? Maybe at a public health level, is there some issue that's kind of globally you're seeing in the SAD diet, the standard American diet? Is there something that you're seeing that's popping out at you?
Yeah, we do see a lot of H. pylori, but, statistically speaking, it's, within that framework because we see that 50% of the world's population is said to have H. pylori. And in the U.S., it's around like 35%. So that seems to be where our statistics come in at too, where, so a third of the time you may see H. pylori because it is that common. Plus, it's something that is a little more highly transmissible. So it's something where just kissing someone, eating off the same plate, sharing food, drinking out of the same cup. So a lot of times there's what they call clusters in families where, both mom and dad have it, the little kids, and the kids are playing together, fingers in their mouth, they're sharing toys that they've drooled on. You can pass H. pylori very easily amongst the family members. So that one's very common. And that's what we often see where, mom's the one coming in because she's, tired and her stomach hurts and she has skin issues and she gets tested and she has H. pylori. But then she brings up, well, my husband has GERD and, my little 6-year-old has some skin issues and my other one just has some maybe mood issues. And so we're thinking maybe we need to test the whole family because there's a good chance that everybody has it, but they may not be manifesting with the same symptoms. So that's one of the most common ones. But parasites, thankfully we don't see as much like Giardia or Cryptosporidium. Those are really nasty ones that live in the small intestine. But I see a lot of some other protozoa like Blastocystis hominis, Dientamoeba fragilis, and both of those have been linked with IBS. And again, Blastos linked with a lot of skin conditions, hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's. We see joint and muscle pain with it. So again, kind of body-wide symptoms, again, not just isolated to the gut.
Now, I also noticed that you provided an interesting report about cytokines. Can you elaborate on that? Is that stool testing, and what is the significance of that?
Yeah, so that's a separate test called the CytoDX, and that one is a blood test. So unfortunately, we can't do that in the stool, so that's a whole separate test kit. Yeah, but that one's nice. I mean, if you are dealing with autoimmunity or other issues, you want to see about, the Th1 balance, Th2, Th17, that's a great test to really dig deep into the cytokines.
So that'll be a nice complement if you do some other analyses. So that's nice. I saw some interleukin 17 and TNF alpha levels, really relatable to what we do in skin every day.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So Lisa, I have a question for you regarding, stepping away from stool testing so much, but maybe just, your approach with diet and whatnot. One of the big things that comes up, we see this frequently, is this low Akkermansia, mucinophilic bacteria, the Faecalibacterium as well. What are some of your dietary approaches that you like to discuss with, your patients? When you were seeing a lot of patients, How did you approach that? Did you ever also include fasting as part of your recommendations? And were there specific foods that you really liked to incorporate when you were talking to them about that?
Yeah. Now, some of these, like acromantia, intermittent fasting is something that can increase its levels. So that is one of the strategies you can use to try to increase it. Now, I always look to see, is someone healthy enough to do intermittent fasting? If their adrenals are a little subpar, there's HPA axis dysfunction. I don't always go there right off the bat. We may need to correct some other issues before they're healthy enough to do that. But what we can do, what we know about acromantia is that it lives in the mucosal lining of the colon and it eats the mucus. So if you don't have good, healthy mucus, it's not going to thrive. So we need to first start by reestablishing a healthy mucosal layer. And one of the ways we do that is through fiber. So if someone hasn't been eating enough fiber in their diet or enough variety of different fibers, a lot of people have ended up restricting a lot of foods. And so now they're down to, yes, they eat fruits and vegetables, but they eat 2 fruits and 2 vegetables, and that's all they rotate in between. Well, that'll feed some organisms, but not the wide variety of organisms you have.
That sounds like my excuse. My mom used to say, eat your fruits and vegetables. And I was like, I ate 2. That's a plural. That's fruits and vegetables.
I eat potatoes and I eat broccoli, and that's all I eat every single day.
That's better than some of the excuses I hear, such as I had ketchup.
Oh, it's a tomato, isn't it?
Well, there you go. And there's probably more than one in there. So there you go. Fruits. Got it. Done. Check.
Done.
Where
Check.
the vegetables at?
Yep. Yeah. So, we have to go back to, a lot of times it comes back to fiber. And some people say, well, I can't eat fiber. Well, that's another issue. Then we need to dig deeper. Why can't you handle the fiber? Chances are there's some dysbiosis. So we may need to do a little bit of weeding before we do some seeding and feed the gut bacteria.
Ooh, I like that. Weeding before the seeding.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
If you haven't trademarked that, we promise not to trademark it, but we're going to use it unabashedly.
Oh, sure. I've heard others say it's not mine. Yep. But I love that term because people understand that, like your plants and everything. So yeah, you got to pick the weeds before you plant your flowers, or you're going to have a mess.
And I actually like it because it does speak to the idea of a balanced gut, not necessarily one part of it completely gone. So I like that. Really kind of freshening it up, getting it ready for the food you're about to give it.
Yeah, and that's what some people freak out. It's like, I saw less than detectable acromantia. It's like, I have no acromantia. It's like, well, technically you probably do have some. It's just below the detectable limit. But most of these microbes are still there. And if you just nurture them, give them the foods that they like, you can make them grow back again and grow into that lush garden. You just need to know the foods that they like. So like acromantia loves red polyphenols. So if I'm trying to get that level up, first we need to lay the foundation. You got to get the fiber in there so you get the good healthy mucus for it. And then you can start to bring in some red polyphenols like cranberry and pomegranate and red dragon fruit. And then you're really going to see it start to flourish.
Well, Lisa, that was a wealth of information. Before we wrap up, I really want to ask you, how do some of our listeners who are on the listening to us today, how can they order this test? We know that the website is to go to Diagnostic Solutions, but how does it go practically? You scoop the poop, and then what do you do with it?
Yeah, so basically you put it outside your door and let FedEx come and pick it up. And then FedEx will take it over to the lab, and then the lab will analyze it, run it through the machines, and then you get a report. And then the report tells you all the different microbes and what the levels were and things about your digestive enzymes and inflammation and, if there's too much fat in your poop. And so the clinician gets a nice report. It's like a 5-page report.
And what is I saw those reports. They look spectacular and really clear and easy to understand. Thank you for doing that. Sometimes you get reports that are like, wait, what is normal? What is abnormal? I'm not sure what was tested here. So thank you. That's very clear at the start. What's the normal turnaround time for these?
Yeah, a lot of times it's like 5 to 7 business days, somewhere in there. So usually like 1 to 2 weeks, somewhere in there. It's usually pretty typical.
And you know what I also learned, Hadar? I also learned that, those magic fairies that I used to watch where you'd put something out in the porch and some goodness would come back to you? Well, it sounds like that's FedEx. and perhaps Diagnostic Solutions Laboratory is part of
Yeah,
that.
exactly. But for somehow in my house, when that happens, usually shoes appear. I don't know if that's the case for you. But
that's a different fairy, but we're not
that's
talking
a different fairy. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about the shopping fairy. Okay, got it.
Yeah,
So
right.
certainly diagnosticsolutionslab.com is the place to go get more information. And Lisa, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise. This was really great to learn more about gut testing and what's out there and what we can learn from it.
No problem. Like I said, I just love talking about everything, poop and organisms. And, I've gone through this myself. I had, you name a parasite, a worm, H. pylori on the stool test. I've had it personally. So I had to go through all those layers myself to get well. So for me, I'm just really passionate about it because I firsthand know the difference it can make to identify what's going on in your gut. So for me, it's just such an important, critical aspect of getting well.
And I really hope that for us as dermatologists, as time progresses, we will learn more and more and get beyond just associations and get to some causality, direct causality, so we can more convincingly treat these conditions and maybe get our patients better. So thank you for taking us one step closer in a small increment. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode with Dr. Raja and Dr. Hadar. This podcast is brought to you by LearnSkin, leaders in integrative dermatology education. Visit learnskin.com/podcast to explore our many programs or subscribe to the podcast today and never miss an episode. Hey, have a great day and stay curious.